It doesn't sound like it, but there are only 4 notes in this entire movement. What's more, this work was actually originally just for solo piano. This is the 3rd movement from Ligeti's Ricercata, a piece with a very simple concept. Start with the first movement with only 2 notes, and add 1 pitch each movement thereafter. Today we're analyzing the simple elegance of this movement, and we're going to see exactly what we can learn about being more resourceful with our orchestrations. Welcome to Score Study. Ligeti's Ricercata has 11 movements. The first movement only includes 2 pitches, D and A, and every movement after that adds 1 pitch class, which is a self-imposed limitation. But even within the movements, he shows some additional compositional restraint. The first movement, which I mentioned was D and A, uses mostly A. It sounds like the piece only has 1 note up until the very last note. D is only used once in the entire movement. This movement, movement 3, has 4, but the pitches that he chose were very strategic. It maximizes the material. He chose C, E flat, E natural, and G, which makes up both the C major and C minor chords. This is a great lesson for composers. We're often concerned about not having enough material when we should really force ourselves to be more resourceful with the material that we do have. We can see that restraint even within the main motif. It's just 2 notes, E flat and C. The rhythm for the motif is very elegant. It constantly expands from 2 16th notes to 2 8th notes and then 2 quarter notes. With only 4 pitch classes, this is a great exercise in phrase structure, melodic contour, and in form. The form itself is nothing very spectacular. It's just an ABA form with a bit of a coda. But it's the way that Ligeti uses these 4 notes to craft phrases and themes, and how he makes that ABA form that really make this movement quite special. So the first thing that we can notice is that the orchestration is about the integrity of the original. Some people may disagree with me on definitions there, but I think if he was to have changed it too much, it would have been an arrangement or a recomposition. But with an orchestration, we're looking to just take the source material and add more instruments to it. So in doing that, Ligeti shows a great deal of restraint. He's got 4 additional instruments to work with, as opposed to just 1 with the piano arrangement. But let's take a listen to both of them back to back and see if you can see how the woodwind quintet version stays very true to the original. So, almost identical. We have these accent chords here that are not really in the piano arrangement, but I think they would have gone there perhaps if Ligeti had had more than 2 hands. As you can see, those accents are lacking in the piano arrangement, but what was he going to do? I mean, both of his hands are already occupied. So Ligeti is showing a great deal of restraint, and that's because, to quote my composition professor, orchestration is not a democracy. Not everyone needs to be playing all of the time. And I think that's something that we as composers need to really deal with, because we have all of this at our disposal, but we don't always need to use everything that we've got. So what that means is that we want to be very intentional about who gets what part and when. I think a great example of that in the woodwind quintet version is right here in the bassoon. The bassoon is playing this bass figure, and it probably could have kept going. Right here. So why does he not continue the bassoon part right there? So right here, the bassoon is adding a bit of motion. It's continuing the momentum as the clarinet presents the theme yet again. But over here, it's not so much about the movement that we're concerned about, it's the back and forth between the oboe and the horn. Now, would it have been wrong for the bassoon to continue? Obviously not wrong, but Ligeti clearly felt that it would be a more effective presentation of the theme for us to focus on the interchange between the oboe and the horn. And we can kind of see that all over the place, where more instruments could have been used, but using less instruments is actually more impactful. So Ligeti stays very true to the original by showing restraint. And so that's tip number 1 for resourceful orchestration. All right, number 2 tip for being resourceful in our orchestrations is to maximize our use of colors. So I think a great example of this use of colors is in measures 27 through 33. The melody is being passed back and forth between the flute, the oboe, and the clarinet. You can see right there, they're just going all the way, and then the bassoon gets involved over here. But what it does, effectively, is it makes the melody less about just the notes and rhythms, and it makes it more about color and about space. And of course, what we mean by color is the specific sound of the pitches. The piano plays this in its arrangement, but the piano sound is very homogeneous, and so it's just about the notes and the rhythms. Over here, however, we have the specific sounds, the specific colors of the flute, of the oboe, and of the clarinet, and that makes this presentation of the theme more vibrant. So I want to take a look at the piano playing measures 27 through 33 first. And then we're back into A. So that's the piano, and now let's listen to the clarinet, flute, and oboe pass that melody back and forth. So you can see how this particular passing back and forth in the melody creates a more vibrant experience of the same theme. We're still using the exact same theme, and obviously each of these 3 instruments all have the range to have played the melody on their own. But it's more colorful for them to pass it back and forth. It's also a theme that lends itself. It's sort of conversational in nature, and so the passing back and forth, I think, is just an incredibly effective use of orchestration here. But not only is it about color, it's also about space, and it may not be as obvious on a recording, but if we were watching this live, the players would physically be sitting in different locations, and so this passing back and forth would come at us in stereo. Instead of the piano, where all of the sound is coming from exactly the same spot, you may have a flute, and then a clarinet, and the flute, a clarinet, and an oboe. And that sense of space, I think, is very underappreciated, especially with chamber music. So with orchestras, you know, obviously they're taking up a very large space, but they're taking up so much space that it's just sort of a wall of sound that comes at you. With the chamber ensemble, however, they're taking up such little space that the sound is coming from just one specific spot. And I think that is something that composers could play around with a lot more, is like where exactly instrumentalists sit on the stage to create the specific panning. So another thing that we can do in our use of color is to pair specific instruments together. And much like food, where we can pair different flavors together and get different results, we can do the same thing with instruments. We don't always just pair the same 2 instruments together and these other 2 are also a pair. We can switch up the pairings, and that gives us, and what that gives us is just continuously new colors. And I think that Ligeti has used those pairings to great effect here. He very clearly has an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of each of these instruments, as well as their specific tone colors, and pairs them very precisely. Let's take a look at what I mean by that. So to begin, we have a doubling of the melody with the flute and the oboe. So as you listen to the melody, try to pick out both the flute and the oboe here. So they pair really, really well together, and that has to do with physics. But part of that is the sort of round, warmer sound of the flute because of its nature. The fact that there's a hole that the players blow into as opposed to having a reed, that gives it that more rounded sound, sort of like a whistle. But then the oboe has a much more nasally sound because of the double reed, which is even more nasally than, say, the clarinet, which is a single reed. So for all of those physical reasons, the oboe and the flute pair really, really well together. And so it makes a lot of sense because he wanted to double the melody to begin with, to reinforce it, to make it a little bit stronger of a statement. The flute and the oboe is a really good pairing. But almost immediately we get a new pairing. The next statement of the theme comes from the clarinet and the bassoon. So once again, clarinet and bassoon pair really, really well together, but they're being used slightly different. The bassoon here has got that this bass figure here. I mean, it's just an arpeggiation, but what that does is it allows some movement to still take place. The bassoon here is a really good choice for what is happening here. The bassoon is a much more nimble instrument than the French horn, and so it can play this really fast, light staccato passage a lot better without the weight of the horn. Obviously, the horn is going to play a fast staccato passage here in a little bit, but it has a lot more weight, and what Ligeti is going for right here is lightness. And so this is a really good pairing here to accomplish all of the things that he wants to create the same effect as the original statement, the original being the piano arrangement. Right after the clarinet and bassoon get done with their statement, we get another pairing, the horn and the oboe, which is a very interesting combination indeed. Very interesting combo, the horn with its weight and its brassiness, and the oboe with its double reed and its nasal quality and its lightness is a very interesting exchange there. I think this is a great example of a less common pairing, and so don't always just go with the instruments that make sense together. Try some different stuff out, and what that does here in this particular sense is it creates a very stark contrast between the different displays of this theme. So we have the oboe. We've heard that iteration of the theme before. We heard that at the beginning. It's very similar to the clarinet statement of the theme, but it's contrasted with the horns, which is a much more powerful, a much more brassy presentation of the theme. And so that's something that you may want to consider, is going with less common instrument pairings to see what sort of specific, unique color combos that gives you. And then he does something very interesting right here in these two measures. So we had a clarinet bassoon statement and then an oboe horn statement, and now he's going to put those two ideas together as we have clarinet and bassoon, and then oboe horn, clarinet bassoon, and then all four of them together. And so that is just really quite elegant. It's very well crafted. These two measures right there are my favorite in the entire orchestration. And we'll talk more about this right here in a little bit. Instrument pairing that I want to look at is the two bass instruments. And so we've talked about how you can pair instruments based on their tone quality, but now let's look at how you can pair instruments based on their range. So we just get this repeated C over and over and over, and it's in the horn and the bassoon. Well, the horns are actually on an E there. That's an E natural. Remember, the horn is transposed a fifth. And I think it's a very interesting spot for that to happen. This is the lowest instruments, and then the flute has actually switched to a piccolo there, and so we have just this major canyon that exists in the ranges. There is a huge section of the sound spectrum that is just entirely missing from this. You have the really low and you have the very high. So not only is this a different color combination, it's actually the only way that the piano part from the original could have been accomplished in the woodwind quintet version, because obviously you need C and E playing, and unless you're dealing with multiphonics, which that's just not practical in most cases, you have to have two instruments to play it, and the bassoon and the horn are the only two instruments that have that. So there is a time and a place for, like, this is not creative in a sense. This is not him thinking strategically about what's going to be the best color combo. This is really just practical. And sometimes that's just a really good piece of advice for orchestrators as well, is do the practical thing, because these two instruments are the only ones that have the range to accomplish this figure. And so he does the practical thing and gives those two parts, those two notes. To that point, we want to make sure that we're focused not just on the ranges of the instruments, but their specific features as well. And I think a really good example of that is right after the intro. We sort of talked about this earlier when we were talking about the bassoon part, but the clarinet and the horn both have the range to play the melody here. But the horn, again, would have been much bigger and much brassier. And what Ligeti is going for here is something light, because we've not made it to the really large section of the piece yet. This is really, really tiny. And so the clarinet is the reasonable choice here to accomplish both the range and the particular articulation and color that Ligeti is looking for. It would have been a very different presentation of the theme if it had been played by the horn. I mean, it'd be very, very different if it was played on the horn. So when you're orchestrating, pay attention not only to the ranges, because a lot of instruments have the range to play things, but pay more specific attention to the specific features, strengths, and weaknesses of those instruments as well. So, idea number 3, score the gesture. This is something else that I picked up from my composition professor. So what is the gesture? Well, a gesture in general is an expression that conveys meaning. So in our context here, it would be a musical idea. And so by scoring the gesture or orchestrating the gesture, what we mean is that the ensemble works together to express that musical idea. They collaborate. They are complementary. They're not just all doing their own thing, they're coming together to express a single idea. So in measure 14, we see the dynamic is being controlled, it's being displayed, not by the dynamic marking on the page, but by the number of instruments that are playing that particular gesture. I said earlier that this was my favorite bit of orchestration in the entire movement, and we're going to talk about why. All right, before I play it, I just want to go ahead and point out what's happening here. So we've had multiple statements of the motif, but now we have this big swell before we go into our next section. And so what could have happened is Ligeti could have chosen to have all 4 of these instruments play the entire gesture, right? We go up and then we come back down and then we land down here. I want to say parenthetically, I think it's really, really funny that he just wrote more forte. It's not fortissimo, it's just slightly more forte than that forte. So we have a forte going into a sforzando and then a subito piano going down into this pianissimo, right? So instead of all 4 instruments playing forte and then sforzando and then all 4 of them playing piano, what we've got is all 4 of these instruments are reinforcing forte, and then just the clarinet continues the piano. And so what that does is this is the instruments, the orchestration is displaying the dynamic gesture. 4 instruments, 1 instrument. So let's take a listen to it. Really, really smooth. Really, really smooth. Once again, this goes back to orchestration is not a democracy, because it's more effective for them to work together to present this gesture of the forte piano, or the forte and the diminuendo, than it is for all 4 of them to play it together. There are a couple of practical things going on in this particular section as well. You'll notice that the flute is not involved in this gesture, and you may be asking why that is. Well, if we look back on the previous page, we see that there's a direction to the flute to switch to piccolo. And so something that is totally possible on Finale or Sibelius Dorica, whatever you're using, is for you to just switch back and forth between flute and piccolo, no problem. But in practicality, we have to give players time to physically change those instruments. This is something that we need to remember even if we're scoring something for percussion and we want them to change mallets. They physically have to take time to switch out their instruments. So that's what the flute is doing there. There's also one other practical thing that's taking place with the fact that the horn and the bassoon don't continue down with this diminuendo, and that gives them a chance to catch their breath before they start this monstrosity. I'm not a horn player, but it doesn't seem terribly fun. Right after that, we have the B section, and the piccolo now has the melody. And the first time the piccolo plays solo through the melody, and you can see here that the piccolo has got these markings that they've got. The beginning of every phrase is marked sforzando, and then the rest of the phrase is marked piano. And that's well and good. The piccolo can do that by themselves. And so it creates this sort of sound. Let's listen to this B theme. But the second time through, we get some reinforcement. This is another orchestration of the gesture. The sforzando is much more effective when it is reinforced by additional instruments. But not only that, the piano is more effective by their silence. So we have the piccolo, the oboe, and the clarinet here, and they're all working together to display this sforzando. What he could have done here is have all three of them play all four of those notes and just marked it sforzando piano. But what's more effective is for them to reinforce the sforzando, and then it's just like we saw earlier with the clarinet continuing on to play the piano by itself. Let's take a listen to the B theme here. All right, let's take a listen to the second iteration of the B theme. So to recap there, the sforzando is reinforced by the clarinet and the oboe playing the first note of the phrase, which is marked sforzando. So the sforzando is reinforced by additional instruments, but the piano is reinforced by their silence. So give special attention to silence as you are orchestrating. So let's recap what we have learned about resourceful orchestration. Number one, orchestration is about the integrity of the original. And remember, we said that orchestration is not a democracy. We want to be intentional about what instrument gets what part and when. Number two, we said we want to maximize our use of colors. And this can be done in passing the melody back and forth. It can be done in different pairings of instruments. And we said we want to pay attention to the specific features, the strengths and weaknesses of each instrument, and not just their ranges. And then number three, we said we need to orchestrate the gesture. And we do that by having the instruments collaborate on specific musical ideas. Let them be complementary and not just have each of them do their own thing. So that is 3 ways that we can be more resourceful in our orchestration. But if you're interested in how to convert your song from 4/4 to 5/8, you can watch the last score study video where the Punch Brothers did exactly that.